Ready. So I just went through this thinking I was recording the whole thing. I didn't record any of it, so maybe this will go smoother than the last one would have gone if it had been recorded. Anyway, so this week, as I was reading, Christopher Columbus and the Manifest Destiny and Desert Solitaire, I realized that there was a common thread of simulacrum and hyperreality. And most of that's from an essay of Baudrillard's, and it's entitled Simulacra and Simulation, and he talks about how images are used and they work as they signify certain aspects of ideology and of any various things, and eventually that signifier basically replaces the signified, and it becomes what it is representing. And I found a couple interesting points in our readings this week that I think apply to that, and I want to share them with you. So in Manifest Destiny, in our module, the second point of it says, America's mission to redeem and remake the world in the image of America. And that goes really, really well with Baudrillard's piece. And I'm going to read the process or the phases of the image, because it goes along with spreading the image of America. So the first phase is the reflection of a basic reality. The second is it masks and perverts a basic reality. The third is it masks the absence of a basic reality. And the fourth is it bears no relation to any reality whatever. It is its own pure simulacrum. And Baudrillard explains a simulacrum as it's kind of like an imitation. He gives an example at the very beginning of his essay where if you pretend to be sick, you go home, you lay in bed and you pretend to be sick. But if you are simulating being sick, then you start to show the signs of the illness and you are treated for the illness. And so he says simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality. It's the hyperreal. And how basically the territory or the illness or whatever the case is exists on its own because it wasn't spurred out of anything necessarily tangible. And he talks about how power does this, how the idea of power, if it's referenced enough and it's bought into enough, then the idea of the power is bought into, and eventually the power becomes real and replaces the pre-existing order that had been there, which is what we'll see in Christopher Columbus's pieces. And there's another, so Baudrillard is postmodernism, which I find really fascinating, the whole relationship between what's reality, what's actuality, what's virtuality. I like those relationships. I think they're really, really interesting. And there's a concept, and I looked all day long and I couldn't find the essay, but there's a concept that goes along with all of this that involves amputation and the amplification of something, especially in technology. So, and one of my professors explained it that any form of technology is amputating some part of our body that we think is necessary and amplifying its abilities. So, for example, glasses are amputating our eyes and amplifying their ability, well, amputating our disabled eyes and amplifying the ability to make them see well again. In the beginning of Desert Solitaire, and I think it's, let me find it, I think it's the second chapter, the one entitled Solitaire, he's talking about a flashlight, which amplifies your limited night vision, amputates your limited night vision and amplifies it so you can see. He says there's another disadvantage to the use of the flashlight. Like many other mechanical gadgets, it tends to separate a man from the world around him. Edward Abbey very much believed in an organic experience with the world. He felt that that was the best way to experience what was around him and for us to experience what is around us. He goes on to say that he's isolated when he's using the flashlight. He can't see what's actually around him. It's amputating his actual experience and amplifying a very limited one. He says in the next paragraph, this peculiar limitation of the machine becomes doubly apparent when I return to the house trailer. And I like how he said that it's a peculiar limitation of a machine. Because a lot of our technology, a lot of our machines do limit us in really subtle ways, I guess. Later in the book, in his chapter called Industrial Tourism in the National Parks, he talks about Americans wanting to travel in their cars and by their cars. And cars are a really, really great example of the amputation of our legs and our feet and amplifying their abilities, because we can go faster and longer and farther than we ever had been able to before. And it's in my book, it's on page 63. I don't know how many different versions of this book there are, but he says, Americans, exactly like the managers of the tourist industry, expect and demand to see their national parks from the comfort, security, and convenience of their automobiles. They work hard, these people. They roll up in incredible mileages on their odometers, rack up state after state in 2-week transcontinental motor marathons, knock off one national park after another, take millions of square yards of photographs, and endure patiently the most prolonged discomforts. The tedious traffic jams, the awful food of park cafeterias, and he goes on to list all these terrible discomforts. And I really like Edward Abbey's approach to all of this. I like that he wants people to focus less on what they feel they can do if they have technology and focus more on what they can actually do and can actually experience. The amputation and amplification of things isn't always bad, because in Christopher Columbus's time, their amplification of travel was a ship, and they were able to go incredible distances and see amazing things. And in the letters this week that Christopher Columbus had written about what he had found, it's really fascinating to see his approach to this new land. So just as part of the Manifest Destiny is to project the image of America, wherever we can and wherever is possible, Christopher Columbus did the same thing as he discovered these people who had existed for a long time before he showed up. It talks about him landing, and he saw, in the second paragraph, he's like, I heard from other Indians I had already taken that this land was an island, and thus followed the eastern coast for 107 leagues until I came to the end of it. From that point I saw another isle to the eastward. at 18 leagues distance, to which I gave the name Hispaniola. Well, good job, Chris. That's great. And he talks about how he named a different one Juana and a different one, I don't even know. He just named all these places because they needed a name and they needed Christopher Columbus. And he talks about how timid these people were and how they were so willing to give whatever they could to him. And he talks about them needing Christianity and them being peculiar but ingenious. But essentially, they really needed the European ideals that Christopher Columbus had. And this is where the simulacra comes back. Because he named all these islands and he took these people captive, and he was basically giving the idea that he had the power to do all these things, and so he was going to do it. And he constantly referenced things as he had named them and as he would do them and how things were going to be run according to him. And because of the constant references, what he at first was misnaming, if somebody came into my house and started calling my stuff some weird name, I'm not going to eventually call it that for them. But that's what happened here. The constant references and the constant, I think, presence of him allowed that simulacra to take place, where what he said and what he was trying to put in place eventually replaced what had already been in place for so long. And Baudrillard talks about this toward the end of his essay. Let me get there. So he's talking about how the ideologies of power replace previous ideologies. And he says, take your desires for reality can be understood as the ultimate slogan for power. For in a non-referential world, even the confusion of the reality principle with the desire principle is less dangerous than contagious hyperreality. So, Christopher Columbus's power and his authority to do everything he was doing was more contagious than dangerous. At the very, very end, Baudrillard said, ideology only corresponds to a betrayal of reality by signs. Simulation corresponds to a short circuit of reality and to its reduplication by signs. So by putting in the signs necessary, Christopher Columbus was able to do what he needed to do, or felt he needed to do, in order to obtain the land for his king and queen. And consumerism in this is able to replace the importance of the national parks by constantly projecting the idea that the number of parks you see in a 2-week period of time is way more important than how much you see of one park in a 2-week period of time, and how much a person can experience it and spend time there, as Edward Abbey was trying to convince and held strong to. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. It came together a lot better than the first time I thought I was recording this, so hopefully that's good. If you have questions, just ask them below. And I'm also going to post a news article I found this morning while I was at work about the arches here in Utah. They've started recording their vibrations, and it was really interesting because in the article they talk a lot about how the machines aren't, they're not negatively affecting the arches. They're not like stabbing stuff into the arches. the way that he describes them marking the road up in this toward the end. I just thought it was really interesting timing. I don't know. Maybe you don't think it's interesting. You don't have to read it, but I just thought it was cool. Anyway, yeah, I hope that made sense and was vaguely interesting to you guys. Stuff like that's really fascinating to me, so hopefully that came across. Okay.